Welcome to our Culture Builders podcast. Here at DecisionWise, we like to highlight leaders that win through people, and their strategies are enhanced and tied to people's success. And I'm joined with my podcast partner, Christian Nielson, who is our Executive Vice President of Consulting here at DecisionWise. My name is Matt Wride, and I'm the President. And today, we're going to talk about John Mackey. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Whole Foods. So I know you've been studying up on John and some things like that, Christian. What's your kind of initial observation, your gut reaction as you've kind of gotten to know him over the past little while?
Yeah, he's a fascinating leader, and I found myself getting more and more interested the more I read about him. And just, he's so interesting. If I had to describe him in a few words, I think it would be authentic, passionate. I might throw hippie into the mix, but I'd also throw a capitalist in the mix. And so he's an interesting blend and has found some really impressive success.
Yeah, I think that word authenticism is really core to who he is. He talks about being authentic and careful at the same time. And he says that that is the most difficult razor's edge to be on, because how are you authentic and then you're constantly careful with interacting with your employees and careful with the market, careful with bankers. And so I sat back and I thought about that statement, and it's true. It's really hard to be authentic and be careful. And yet we hold people to that standard all the time. You know, if we say, hey, bring your authentic self, and yet we don't allow people the freedom to sort of be a little bit organic and a little bit themselves in the process.
Well, I might be jumping ahead as well, but just along that authentic but careful, I believe I heard the same interview where he was kind of describing that, or at least I heard something similar. And it showed some amazing self-awareness and some high emotional intelligence. And what was interesting is he also was aware that he has to be careful, because if he says something controversial, he's okay taking the heat, but he doesn't want that to fall to his baby, his company, and the people that are stakeholders there. So a really interesting and pretty engaging guy.
Let me give you a bit of a basic bio. He was born in Texas. His father was an accountant and a healthcare executive. And he was attending college. He had been in college for a long time. He kind of bounced around college for 6 years and actually never graduated. But in 1978, he and his then girlfriend borrowed $45,000, which is a chunk of change back then. And they opened up a health food store known as Safer Way. And I'm just thinking, good thing that it wasn't very well known because of the trademark problem with Safer Way.
What do you think he'd do if we opened Wholer Foods right now?
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, he kind of became an evangelist. He says he grew up eating mac and cheese and TV dinners and the whole kind of quintessential 60s, 70s experience most American folks had, but he really bought into natural foods, no sugar, no meat, those types of things. And so he became evangelist for this and then started, building the business. Now, he had to learn along the way. I don't know if you came across the story where he realized that he had to sell more than just what he liked. He was kind of struggling because his offering was so limited, because he just sort of sold what he thought was appropriate. And he had to realize that he had to have a sense of the market. And this brings up your point that he is kind of this mix of hippie and capitalist all at the same time. One of the most interesting events that I just want to highlight is just the 2017 purchase by Jana Partners. It's a hedge fund that went out and bought 9% of Whole Foods. Whole Foods was publicly traded, and they bought 9% of the shares and actively said they were going to be an activist investor. They were going to start pushing Whole Foods to do things differently. And you commented that you called Whole Foods his baby. Well, that changed everything, and it led him to approach Amazon, who sort of made some inquiries in the past, went back to Amazon, and he sold Whole Foods to Amazon for $13 billion in August of 2017. But interestingly, he had stopped taking a lot of stock options and stopped being really part of the wealth process of Whole Foods early, and so he didn't make a ton of money on that deal. It wasn't a huge exit event for him, and that was okay. He was comfortable with that. Well, just a couple mantras to set the stage that I think are funny. Well, not funny, but interesting. Whole Foods, he says, Whole Foods market doesn't primarily care about money. It primarily cares about fulfilling its purpose, and so do I. And then something he sort of kind of repeats to himself throughout the day, being fully present, fully in my heart and fully in my higher self. I think that little mantra probably describes him as well as anything, Christian.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I think throughout our conversation and just exposure to him, that authenticity keeps coming through, and just how unique he is. But also, kind of underscores this broader thing that I think people are looking for something they can believe in. They want to believe that someone's driven by something more than just money and greed and, and some of these things. And when someone's passionate and committed and leads with values, people want to get on board. And especially where we start to see that formula works and works to this extent, it's pretty contagious.
1998, Whole Foods was named to the 100 best companies to work for. And at that time, and that list is still an impressive list, but it was, when it first came out, that was the list of all lists. And it has perennially topped that list or been near the top for so long as one of the great companies to work for. And so he's obviously committed to a culture. There's a story how an employee had to come to terms with the dress code. They changed the dress code. It wasn't anything harsh, but it was really mellow, really not flashy, sort of basic colors, things like that. And she said, it was hard because she felt like Whole Foods was a place where you kind of and this was a quote, let your freak flag fly. You could kind of come and be this crazy person and be part of the culture, and all of a sudden they're toning it down and wearing grays and blacks and things. So they've navigated those challenges pretty well.
That's, I think, a challenge for any organization with a unique culture is how do you scale and reach a broader audience, but also keep what's special. And, it's like you think through Austin or Portland where all the signs of, keep Austin weird, or, there's some aspect of that with Whole Foods. And you can imagine those people, that these unique personalities and souls that were really drawn to it in the early days, as it got mass appeal, that can be an identity challenge.
Yeah. Well, I was going to grab some observations that I found, and then you and I can react to them together. One of the things stood out is no special parking spaces at headquarters. So he tries to arrive early to make sure he gets a good parking space. So that egalitarian view, his office is very modest in size. It's not about the typical no private plane. It's just not what you would expect from a chief executive of a major player in the area, in the market.
Yeah, too often we're just used to seeing people get power and just revel in the privileges that company, and to the point where we just accept it. Yeah, well, of course they're going to have a golden parking spot or a helipad on the roof or something. But I caught that as well, where he said, well, no, it shouldn't be that. You should reward whoever gets there the first, gets the best parking spot. We want to encourage people in that type of culture, and down to that level, it's pretty instructive.
Well, you and I talk so much about how here at DecisionWise, we know that one of the key drivers of an engaged workforce and engaged culture is belonging. And I think when you put up barriers, when some people are more equal than others because they have spots, that doesn't create any sense of belonging. But when everybody's the same and when a leader sort of is treated the same, I think that's actually a great way to build belonging, because you sort of feel like you're all in it together and that there's no real distinctions. I don't know. Right. You have any thoughts about that?
A lot of those types of things we overlook, but there's things that employees encounter every day that unconsciously symbolize or signal that there's a difference between you and the boss, and that they first have something that you don't, or some kind of rights or privileges that separate them. And so a lot of those things, I think if you can remove them or minimize just how present they are in the environment, you can tie people together. You can build this deeper sense of belonging. And I think John has caught on to that.
The one concept that he talked about to me that really resonated with me was how building a team is important and how to build a diverse team. But he had some theories, I guess you might call them, that were different than most everybody. He said, first of all, we hire people like us because it's a bit protectionist. We're hardwired to sort of hang out with the same people because we think it's going to help us out in the long run. But that hurts diversity. But he said, in diversity and equity and inclusion, you have observables and unobservables. And he said a lot of time we just go to these observables, which are the things you can see. And those are important, but they don't necessarily mean diversity of thought. And he went on to talk about how he also probes further and wants to find people who think differently and have a different perspective on things like how the store should be run or the products. And so he works on staffing teams and his board and everything with what he calls diversity of skill sets. What are your thoughts about that?
We see it too often that it's more comfortable for us to hire and kind of stock the pond around us with people like us, whether that's in appearance or more often just in thinking or bias or mental models. And so to create a team that will challenge our thinking and also complement our strengths and fill in some of the gaps where we don't have a strength, I think that's what we see some of the best leaders in the world have done, where they've not done what's comfortable, they've done what's going to push them and the organization to new heights.
Yeah, I just think it's important as we think about building a culture and striving for this diversity of thought that we think about avoiding groupthink and think about solidarity. If you think about it, it can kind of create an us versus them, but really it's about diversity of experiences, diversity of cultures, diversity of all these different factors that come into making it work. Wage transparency at Whole Foods. You probably came across this, but everybody knows what everybody makes. How do you feel about that?
I think it's a beautiful concept. I'd love to see a documentary on how that works and actually get a feel for that, because it's so hard to imagine actually implementing that, especially. And I can't remember the details if it was always that way or if that was something, hey, we decide from here on out, this is where we're going to. I think it would be easier to go with that from the ground up for the startup venture and say this is the way we've always operated. I think that would be a pretty dramatic culture shift for most organizations. And it's noble. And there's a part of me that's just wildly curious about what are the benefits of that and how does it open up and unlock and just connect people. But I'm also curious about the pitfalls and where there'd be challenges with trying to implement that with established organizations.
What I thought was interesting was one of the justifications he gave for it, not that he needs a justification, but he said a benefit of wage transparency is it's a communication tool. He lets the workforce know what they value.
Right.
And so if you're savvy and you can look at the wage reports, you understand what's important. And that's one of the downsides of not having it. But, we'll have to leave that for another podcast where we debate this. But I did think that was an interesting insight that he uses it as a way to communicate what's important to the organization.
Well, he's got a wisdom. Just listening to him talk, it's kind of almost a folksy, down to earth kind of way of looking at the world that it's easy to kind of buy in and you want to learn more. So I like that transparency as a communication tool. I think is spot on. This is what we value, and so there's higher value associated with it.
There are three more little tidbits I wanted to share. One is his win-win-win model, and then how he tours his store, and then we're going to end with the tall poppies, and then whatever else you want to bring to the table. But his win-win-win model, usually we think of win-win, but he describes it as the two parties to the transaction. That's the win and the win, but there's this third win, and that's what's in the best interest of society. This conscious capitalism, this push for double line investing. There's two bottom lines. There's the bottom line of profit, but there's a bottom line of the impact we have on our society, our culture, the environment. All of those things are part of that double bottom line. And so he talks about the win-win-win model a lot. The second one was touring stores. He commented that when he tours a store, because of his position, he rarely wants to engage in redirecting feedback or anything that's could be construed as criticism. He just stays super positive because he's realized that if he can give 10 compliments, but the one criticism will just devastate morale. And so he's like, it's just not worth it. It just muddies the message so much that he'll figure out a way later to do that. What are your thoughts there? Because we're in the feedback business, and there's a lot of people out there say, yeah, you need to be brutally honest. But he kind of makes a point that sometimes the message can get lost if you're not aware of the context of your message.
I think it's an amazing lesson in self-awareness again, where he knows, well, we're always talking to leaders about, asking this self-coaching question of what experience am I creating? And he understands that if he goes in there and even if he's overly complimentary and, effusive with praise, if he has that one critical moment, that's all they're going to remember. And whether he's learned that from, so much experience and where he's gotten it wrong, or whether it's just an innate understanding that he came with, it's an amazing realization that you don't want to leave people feeling deflated, or just understanding that a simple behavior from someone at that high in an organization can have a lot of unintended consequences. Worst case, someone might get fired after he leaves the store because of a small remark he made. So I love that awareness. He mentioned he does still provide the feedback. He does it in private and things like that, but some nice self-awareness.
Somebody talked about him being a tall poppy, and what that is that's reference. This was actually one of the person interviewing talked about the tall poppy syndrome, where there's a story where it's the tall poppies that get cut first and those that shine and grow. And he's been the subject of a lot of criticism at times, and he's out there and he has views that don't line up with what a safe CEO would say. And it's a little bit about being different and being up and being a tall poppy, being out there. You're willing to put yourself out there and promote ideas that are important, but then people take a swipe at you. And I was sort of curious as to your thoughts about that in an organization, Christian. How do we help leaders shine and grow, and how do we keep them from being viewed as tall poppies and putting a bullseye on their back?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all goes to the overall culture that you're creating. I've been, I know you and I both probably worked in environments that can be pretty cutthroat. And then the language of the land can be, hey, if that person succeeds, I'm somehow failing. And, being aware that we can create those environments very, very easily if we're not paying close attention to praise, to incentives, to how, the behaviors at the top, and if there's silos at the top or kind of some of those patterns, they can get cascaded throughout the organization, and very quickly you can have this toxic culture where we want people to maximize their potential, and we should be happy to see our peers and direct reports succeed and things like that. And so it's a larger conversation. It happens at many levels in the organization, but I do love the analogy that this tall poppy often gets cut first simply because it's exceptional.
Yeah. Well, those were sort of my core takeaways that I wanted to talk about today. I don't know if you came across anything else you wanted to share with our audience in kind of researching and spending some time virtually with John Mackey.
No, just his enthusiasm and his passion, it stands out. We've seen it with other leaders, especially founders, where they have this deep connection to not just making a successful business, but something a little more, a deeper sense of meaning and purpose, trying to influence the marketplace. He had some ethics that are definitely tied to his business and things. But I think just one thing that stuck with me is hearing someone ask him a question about what happens when you're no longer the CEO. And he had, again, some wonderful self-awareness. He said, I realize nobody's going to love Whole Foods as much as I have. But it's, again, he used the analogy of it being like his child, where he said, but you do the best you can to build it to a point where it can take care of itself. And you hope it'll continue on with integrity and the values that you tried to instill. And I just thought it was a really interesting and beautiful analogy or metaphor that he left around how he views it. And also just aware that it will change to some extent when he's not there, because it has to, but it doesn't necessarily mean it needs to go to a bad place. So just a really interesting person. I don't necessarily shop at Whole Foods very often, but it makes me want to go there a little bit more. My wife certainly goes there. But again, it's contagious, the passion, the energy, and the authenticity that this man has brought to a very successful business.
He's written two well-known books, Conscious Capitalism, and then in the fall released Conscious Leadership. And so we'll try to put a link to those in our social media pages and things. But he's a great study, a great read, and really a great culture builder. And it's been a lot of fun researching and getting to know him better. We want to thank our audience for joining us today. If you have questions, you can email us at info@decisionwise.com, or if you have suggestions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. And we just want to encourage people to realize the value of people in business success. It's without your people, you're just never going to get where you need to go. So culture builders are our idols, if you will. So thanks everybody, and we'll talk to you in the next episode.
Thanks.